Welcome to the Author's Corner. The recent as well as ongoing protests in Cuba have sparked another debate over capitalism versus socialism and its merits. You'll hear a lot of things in the news about why the various protests are going on in Cuba. Many people have their own explanations. On this episode, we'll be diving deep into the details for a rigorous analysis as always. And joining us today is AIER Senior Fellow and Professor of Economics at Stanford University in Alabama, Art Carden. Art, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be on.
So let's dive right into it. So we've heard a lot of things about why Cuba's protesting. We've heard it's because of vaccines. We've heard because of the embargo. Of course, we've heard it's because of the oppressive communist government. So can you bring us up to speed on why are the Cubans protesting? Why are people saying so many different things about it? And can you explain kind of what do you think is the real reason that these protests are going on?
So there are a lot of things going on right now in Cuba. Of course, you have shortages of medical supplies, you have shortages of food. A lot of this, of course, has been exacerbated by COVID and COVID-related policy. One of the things that has apparently really set this off actually has been a song, Patria y Vida, by a group of I guess, Cuban exiles now, arguing that the Cubans should, in fact, rebel against the revolution. And things have kind of come to a head because people can only wait in long lines for stuff for so long before they really start to get sick of it. And a lot of what we're seeing right now in Cuba is people rising up and saying, okay, we do not like this anymore. We're done with Castro. We're done with the revolution. We're done with shortages. We're done with fill in the blank. And that I think is that I think fundamentally is what's going on the island. Now you get a bunch of different perspectives on it, based on people's political beliefs and based on what people already. From the right, in particular from Cubans in South Florida, they're hoping is sort of the final crisis of communism in a sense in Cuba. That this is finally the day that the regime comes down, and they're working very, very hard to move in that direction. Then, of course, from the left, the argument is, well, actually, it's because of the Us embargo on Cuba. And if you actually look, there are people who are protesting in favor of the revolutionary government, and this is being driven by kind of astroturf efforts on the part of the U.S. government and Cuban exiles who want to get back in and take the land that they had in the 50s.
So on that note, we talk about a lot why socialism leads to a lot of the issues that you described when it comes to having long queues, resource shortages, what have you. From a technical standpoint, why is that? Like, why do we always see the same thing happening in these Soviet-style republics?
Yeah, so the major reason why socialism fails is because it can't engage in rational economic calculation. In 1920, Ludwig von Mises wrote an article called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, which a couple of years later he expanded into a book. And in it, he argued that even if you have perfect people, angelic beings running the state, and even if you know exactly what to produce, and even if you know literally every possible way to produce, and even if you know your entire inventory of potential things with which you can produce, a socialist economy still can't calculate because they don't have market prices for the means of production. Okay, and this I think is a crucial point that goes up against the idea of market socialism that would appear a little bit later. Mises argues, okay, yeah, sure, even if you have markets in finished goods and services, you are still unable to calculate. You're still unable to figure out what are the least cost ways of producing things because you have no markets for the means of production, no markets for capital, no markets for tools, no markets for machinery. You compound that with the fact that there's so much production is essentially directed and prices of consumers' goods are not set by markets, and you end up with what Mises would call planned chaos, which is basically this whole huge mash of more or less arbitrary production processes where it is very, very difficult. Well, indeed, it's in fact impossible for the planners to know what to produce and where it needs to go.
And so on that, you just described obviously why the technical shortcomings of socialism are real. We obviously do a lot of socialist bashing at AIER. Sure, people who watch the show and read our stuff are on the same page. I think it's always good to be specific. So how would you describe socialism? Like, what is it technically, and how does it lead to those shortcomings that you just described?
Okay, so this raises a really good and really important point about the rhetoric of economic systems. It is really important to be very, very careful about specifying precisely what we mean when we talk about socialism, or when we talk about capitalism, or when we talk about apartheid, when we talk about imperialism, when we talk about any of these things. And there is a long-running debate about whether or not this or that example of socialism is in fact actually socialism. One popular move is, once a socialist system has failed, is to say, well, no, that actually wasn't really socialism, that was state capitalism. And in fairness, in response to a recent piece that I wrote for AIER, the Socialist Party of Great Britain pointed out that, yeah, okay, we've actually been saying that Cuba is state capitalism for a very, very long time. But I think again, it's really, really important to be clear and precise about exactly what you mean when you're talking about socialism or capitalism. And a lot of people want to define socialism in terms of its stated goals, in terms of the hoped for results that we would get by nationalizing the means of production. And say, okay, well, socialism is everybody's equal, everybody's got a say, everybody's fully fed and clothed, etc. Again, though, that doesn't describe the social processes that are going on underneath the hood. The definition of socialism that I like to use is the one that Robert Heilbronner discusses in his article on socialism for the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics. And he says a socialist economy is one in which the government owns and controls the means of production. Okay. A socialist economy is one in which the government owns and controls the means of production, and decisions about what to produce and how are made centrally rather than via the decentralized market process.
So this brings us to the article you just mentioned that you published with AIER, which is cleverly titled "Cuba Demoted to Not Real Socialism." So can you explain to maybe someone who's maybe not aware of this common rhetorical tool what you meant by that? Why is that even a relevant ploy to use in this context?
Well, because there's a really fantastic book that was published a couple of years ago by Christian Niemitz from the Institute of Economic Affairs called "Socialism: The Failed Idea That Never Dies." And he pointed out something that tends to happen when people look at, or when people talk about various socialist regimes. The regime pops up and everybody says, okay, well, look, this is great. This is the socialist future. This is wonderful. This is going to show us that socialism works. Okay, that's what he calls the honeymoon phase. And then there are always going to be, at the very, very beginning, a few examples of things that look like they're going pretty well. The two most common examples in Cuba, or in people's discussions of Cuba, are literacy programs and healthcare. Okay, which seem to look more or less okay. People say, oh, look, this shows us that socialism can work, that socialism is working, that socialism, again, is how we should organize everything. Then we end up with more failure. We end up seeing, okay, well, there are problems with socialism, and we end up with crackdowns, we end up with authoritarianism, we end up with poverty, we end up with these long lines we were talking about. And people, they move into what Niemitz calls the excuses and whataboutery stage, which would be, okay, well, it's not socialism that is causing this problem. It's, in the case of the Soviet Union in the 1950s, it's the weather. Or in the case of Cuba, it's not socialism's fault, it's the US embargo. Or people might say, well, okay, sure, the Castro regime is imperfect, but look at what's going on in the United States with mass incarceration and things of that nature. And indeed, these are important things to talk about and important things to discuss, but I don't really think they get socialism off the hook. Then finally, as Niemitz points out, once it becomes clear that this or that socialist experiment has failed, as it has in the Soviet Union, as it has in North Korea, as it has in Eastern Europe, as it has in Cuba, in Venezuela, and pretty much everywhere it's been tried, then it becomes, well, that wasn't real socialism. Real socialism would be workers' control of the means of production. It wouldn't be controlled by a state or a central committee. what you're calling socialism is in fact actually a degraded worker state or state capitalism or some other term. What's interesting again is that there's not really a whole lot of rhetoric that Niemitz points out where people are predicting ahead of time, saying, okay, no, this is state capitalism, it's going to fail. Rather, people will look at the revolution here, the revolution there, and say, well, this is socialism, it's going to work. And then when it doesn't, then they start referring to it. Then they say, well, that wasn't real socialism. If we try this and get it right, then things will really go well.
And so you mentioned how there's a lot of pivoting and semantic back and forth about this state not being real socialism. That's actually insert fancy title here. So you see that as almost as a form of intellectual cowardice or obscurantism. And if so, like, how do we actually approach people and to, like, really confront them on their ideas if they're going to just keep bouncing around with these terms?
I don't think it's necessarily cowardice or being obscure. I think a lot of it is just simply being human. We are wedded to our ideals. I think it was Schumpeter who said the first thing that somebody will do for their ideals is lie. And Friedrich Hayek once said it's extremely difficult to convince somebody that they're wrong, because by admitting they're wrong, they experience what he calls they experience a capital loss. They're worse off. And I don't think there's anything especially unique about socialism or about the left in this regard. One thing that I have to watch myself for is saying, okay, well, that wasn't really capitalism, or that wasn't really the free market, or that wasn't really whatever sort of thing. In social psychology, there's a lot of literature suggesting that when people confront information, they look at information they agree with very differently from information that they disagree with. When they confront something that confirms what they already want to believe, they ask, okay, can I believe this? And when they confront something that is inconsistent with what they already believe, they ask, do I have to believe this? And they're much more critical of the do I have to believe this propositions than they are of stuff that they already want to believe, that they already want to embrace. We see this in religious apologetics. We see this in political apologetics. We see this in sports, honestly. College football season is right around the corner. I'm a graduate of the University of Alabama. We're excited about possibly welcoming Texas and Oklahoma into the Southeastern Conference. And of course, every time I watch a football game, my team can do no wrong. The Crimson Tide can do no wrong. They're men of virtue and goodwill who are kind to their mothers. And meanwhile, the other team, they're all pirates and brigands and ne'er-do-wells who are cheating constantly. And it's funny because you see this from both sides. And I think that's what you see politically is very much a lot like what you see when people are watching college football.
Well, I went to a small liberal arts college, so I don't really have that college football commitment, but certainly sounds like a fun time. I guess on that topic of the different types, whatever you're going to call it, state capitalism, not real socialism, what have you. But why do we keep seeing these resource shortages and many times full-out genocide have we seen in Cambodia, especially China, like what in the Soviet Union also, like there's just on top of the aforementioned economic issues, we also have these these insane abuses of power that you've never really witnessed in a liberal democracy. So why do you think that keeps happening?
Yeah, so here again, it's very important to be clear about definitions. And we should look at our sort of team affiliations and say, okay, well, this is the reason why we have to be very clear about what we're talking about. If we're talking about centralized or government ownership and control of the means of production, then we have to look at where that's been tried and what the results have been. And as we've seen, communism or socialism in the Soviet Union, China, et cetera, has just produced a mountain of corpses, totalitarian mass murder. And I think that this is due to a couple of different things. First, it's just straight up power struggle. It is wanting to wipe out anybody who's a threat to the power that you might seize or the power that you might want to seize. We saw this from the very, very beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution. As Brian Kaplan has argued, the original Bolsheviks, they were idealists, but their ideal was bloodthirsty totalitarian mass murder because they wanted to, first of all, they just wanted power. But then second, there's an idea that that socialism will work if we fundamentally change and alter human nature. And if you are in the business of fundamentally changing human beings, then it gets really, really easy to abstract away from the humanity of those you see as distinct and degraded. Finally, when you're doing something in the name of a grand vision, you can excuse all sorts of horrors because the ends justify the means. The problems with socialism stem from the fact that in a lot of ways, and I've been meaning to write about this, in a lot of ways, socialism by definition or by necessity has to be a type of mind control. So Julian Simon argued that the human mind is the ultimate resource, that this is sort of the factor of production. Well, if the government is owning and controlling the means of production, then in some sense they have to own and control the minds of the populace. Furthermore, in trying to veto the decisions that the market is making about the value of goods and services or about the value of capital goods, what they're doing is they're actually throwing away information. They're throwing away information, they're throwing away people's knowledge. Finally, the government, when the government owns and controls the means of production, this means they own and control the intellectual means of production, they own and control the means of educational production, they own and control the printing presses, the ink, the paper, the server space, etc. And it's naive to think that they won't use that control to filter the messages that people are willing and able to receive. One of the problems, or one of the glories of liberal democracy or free market capitalism, is that it can admit or it can tolerate experiments in socialism. If you want to form a commune, you're more than welcome to do that. The problem with communism and socialism is they can't countenance capitalist experiments, or they can't countenance free market experiments. The way again that I remember hearing the way that Walter Williams put this one time. He said his problem with communists isn't that they want to be communists, and he's fine if they want to be communists, that's great. His problem with communists is that they insist that he be a communist as well. And this, I think, is a nice illustration of the way that socialism and communism really can brook no dissent.
So before we move into our last question, I think it's appropriate that we also make the case of why we should prefer our system, markets, liberal democracy. So I guess I'll let you explain the rest, but I'd preface it by saying that's why they create the system that we live in. So can you explain why what we have is worth defending? Like, why does it lead to better outcomes than what the socialists would like?
Yeah, so so socialism, in order for socialism to work, you have to have a fundamental change in human nature. You have to have people acting and behaving in a way that people have basically never acted and behaved, or that they have, to the extent that they have acted and behaved that way, it's been on a very, very small scale. So families, for example, are tiny little socialist enterprises. The way that a family operates is from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. We don't market mediate all of the transactions in a family, and that's for very, very good reasons. The problem is it doesn't really scale up. The farther away we get from people, geographically, socially, etc., the less easy it is to understand exactly what it is that they want, or to understand exactly what it is that they need, without making some very heroic assumptions about our ability to plan other people's lives. Among the reasons why I think why free market capitalism, liberal democracy, what Deirdre McCloskey and I call innovism in our book, is first of all, it pays off. It has created wealth, prosperity, and peace unlike anything the world has ever seen. Extreme poverty around the world is falling like a stone. Life expectancy is increasing dramatically. And all of this has been happening in the last couple of centuries due to the fact that we have embraced, basically, business, liberty, commerce, and all of the stuff that we think of as the elements of a commercial society. From a strictly utilitarian standpoint, if you want to look at expanded capacity for human flourishing, capitalism checks all the boxes. Again, pick any measure basically, by which we can consider people better off over the long run, and liberal societies have been the ones where those have been clearest, where those have been the most obvious. Another reason why I think capitalism or innovism is worth defending is because it respects our fundamental humanity. It allows us to be wrong. It allows us to It allows us to seek our own paths, not dictated by the ideas of some group of people in the seminar room who understand how we should really live. So I think in addition to prosperity, I think another reason why liberal capitalism, liberal democracy, innovism are worth defending is because of their profound respect for human dignity.
And so this brings us to our last question, and also the concluding statements of your article, which are that, we can debate all day about socialism versus capitalism. It's a very ivory tower thing. At the end of the day, people are risking their lives to leave Cuba, to leave North Korea, to leave Cambodia, what have you, to come to places like here, United States. And that's obviously a fundamental affirmation of our system over theirs. So can you explain what the big takeaway from that whole phenomenon, and maybe some key pointers for moving forward for people who are in charge, people who want to comment on these issues, what have you?
Migration patterns are very informative. People via migration vote with their feet for different combinations of institutions. Of course, just because you move into a country doesn't mean that you affirm literally everything that that country stands for, literally all of the rules. You just happen to think it might be better than the alternative, or it might be better than the status quo. Sure, let's assume that everything people say about Cuba's literacy programs and healthcare are absolutely 100% true. That raises the question then of why people are risking life and limb to put together makeshift rafts to try to leave Cuba and come to the United States, where presumably they're going to be exploited or what have you. It doesn't explain why people are leaving in massive numbers, quote unquote, workers' paradises, and why that has typically been the case over during the time when people were experimenting with communism. You don't have a whole lot of people trying to sneak into Cuba. You do have a lot of people trying to sneak out of Cuba and into the United States. The example of East and West Germany, I think is particularly instructive. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and it's important to recognize that the East German government put up the wall in order to keep people in. Okay, they put up the wall in order to keep people from leaving the workers' paradise that was East Germany and migrating to West Germany. In fact, they shot people for trying to escape. I think that itself is compelling evidence that the institutions of liberal democracy, free market capitalism, innovism are of socialism, as judged by the people who live under socialism themselves. Not the party apparatchiks, not the top level elites, but the day-to-day people who live in socialist countries who are trying in many cases desperately to get out of these countries and get into relatively wealthy countries like the United States.
And with that, we'll call that one excellent interview. Art, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, if you want to keep up with AIER's content, make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, as well as check out our website at aier.org. If you want to support more cutting-edge scholarships such as this, consider becoming a donor. All that information and more can be found at aier.org. Thank you.